As you recall from earlier presentations, the founders of Arizona's Constitution were heavily influenced by the progressive movement. In addition, they were influenced by their experience in the territories of having a territorial legislature and a territorial governor that was often viewed as corrupt, captured by corporate and business interests, and in the case of the territorial governor, carpetbaggers who were appointed by the president and were not really connected to or even answerable to the people who lived in the territory. So as a result of this experience and their progressive impulses, the power of the executive branch in Arizona is more divided than it is in most places. This makes the executive branch fairly weak compared to other state governments. Arizona has what's called a plural executive. This means that officials in the executive branch are elected separately. They're not appointed by the governor. In the federal government, the president is able to appoint all of the cabinet officials, the heads of all of the federal agencies, and all of the other executive level officers in the executive branch. As these people serve at the discretion of the president, their agenda remains in line with the president's agenda. If the head of an agency is working cross purposes with the president, that person will either change their position or be removed. In the state, however, the people that are necessary to promote a policy agenda are independently elected. This means that the governor cannot count on their support and certainly cannot require their cooperation. In many cases, the top executive officials in the state are from separate political parties and have contradicting agendas. This makes it very difficult to accomplish the governor's agenda. Now, presumably, this is exactly what the framers of the Arizona Constitution had in mind. With the early territorial government corrupt and captured by corporate interests, the progressive framers wanted to make sure that all of the major policymakers in the state were directly answerable to the people to minimize the possibility of this occurring. The executive offices that are elected positions are the governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, the superintendent of public instruction, the state mine inspector, and the corporation commission. Having this many offices held by people with independent power bases means that in Arizona, we often see gridlock that is similar to what we see in the federal government when the president and Congress are controlled by separate parties. Only in Arizona, the gridlock that occurs within the executive branch is in addition to whatever gridlock may occur between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. There have been several times in recent Arizona history where elected officials in the executive branch have been at war with one another. Now, this has been particularly true at the county level in the last few years, which also operates under a plural executive model. For example, internal battles in Maricopa County have dominated politics there for almost 20 years, with fights between the sheriff and the county attorney, and then between the sheriff and the attorney and county supervisors. I'll provide more details on that conflict when we have our presentation on county government. But similar battles occur at the state level, in particular between the governor and the attorney general. Those two are often at odds. This presentation is being recorded in the summer of 2010, And the current struggle between Governor Brewer and Attorney General Goddard is a good illustration of the gridlock that can result from this divided power. In particular, these two individuals are at odds over how to handle immigration policy. And this led to an unusual situation where Senate Bill 1070, which is the immigration bill that was passed in 2010, contains a provision in the law that authorizes the governor to hire a private law firm to defend that law when it would be challenged in court. Now, this is because the state legislature felt that Goddard could not be trusted to defend the law, given the fact that Goddard and Brewer would be competing against each other in the gubernatorial election that fall. Now, Goddard, as Attorney General, is required to defend the state when it is sued by the federal government. And so it's highly unusual for the legislature to authorize the governor to hire a private attorney to defend the state in those cases. The point to make here is that other states do not have as many officials with independent power bases. So in other states, the governor is able to more forcefully direct the executive branch. Not so here in Arizona. It's much more difficult for the governor to convince or corral all of the important agents within the executive branch to work towards a common end. In this presentation, we will look at each of the elected offices in the executive branch. And let's begin by focusing on the governor, as the governor's office is the most visible and arguably the most powerful elected office in the state. This slide shows the previous 4 governors for Arizona. Now, the roles that the governor plays for the state are similar but not quite the same as the roles that the president plays for the country. Again, the president is the chief executive for the country. The governor is the chief executive for the state. So let's revisit some of that discussion about executive roles that were discussed in Presentation 8. As a reminder, the roles that the president plays in performing the duty of the chief executive is the head of state, the CEO of the executive branch, the party leader, the national leader, and the world leader. Similarly, the governor functions as the head of state, the state's chief lobbyist and state leader, and the CEO of the executive branch. Now, while the governor is expected to help the strength of the political party that she is from, the governor is not expected to undertake the fundraising and campaigning duties that the president does. The strength and success of the party is not viewed as a primary responsibility for the governor. So, let's look at each of these roles that the governor plays in detail. As the head of state, the governor is the most visible person from the state. The governor is expected to address any major crises that occur in the state. So when there is a forest fire or a natural disaster, a flooding in the reservations, or a health outbreak with the flu, or some virus that comes out, the governor is the person who goes in front of the cameras, declares a state of emergency, goes to the scene of the crisis, and tries to shore up the morale and bolster the resources of the state to address that problem. The governor is also the spokesperson for issues or legislation that is important to the state. So, making sure Arizona's water rights are taken care of, making sure our public lands the Arizona's voice is heard in those federal debates on those issues. The governor is also expected to just generally be a good public relations spokesperson and put a positive face on the state. Now, this quality is subjective, and some people are better at it than others. Governor Meekum, for example, was notorious for his frequent gaffes and insensitive comments, even though by all accounts he was a kind and personable person in person. Governors Mofford and Symington were better at PR while they were governor. They charmed journalists and other politicians easily. Recently, the controversy surrounding SB 1070 has placed Arizona in the national spotlight. Governor Brewer has struggled to control the discourse and the debate about the law and about immigration policy in general. She's done this through her own press conferences, appearing in the national media quite frequently, and even visiting with President Obama in the White House. While not all governors have such a visible opportunity to function as the head of state, all governors have to figure out how to best be the embodiment of the state that comes with the head of state role. Another role that the governor has as part of the head of state function is to be the commander-in-chief of the state's armed forces. Now, in the modern era, that means the Arizona National Guard. In times of emergency, the governor can call up the National Guard and assign them to assist people in need and maintain law and order in a chaotic situation. This is otherwise a largely symbolic role, although some governors have used it to great effect. Governor Hunt, the storied early governor who served several terms, enjoyed taking this role literally and camped with the troops on their training excursions. Governor Symington used the National Guard to make a political point when he called up the Guard and posted them at the entrance to the Grand Canyon as part of a dispute with the federal government over its threatened closure in the 1990s. The federal government was going to close down the Grand Canyon as part of an overall closure of the government during a budget dispute between President Clinton and the Republican Congress. And so Symington threatened to use the National Guard to keep the park open, even if the federal government closed it. Now, they didn't follow through on that, and all that happened were a few guardsmen stood by the entrance to the park, but the threat of doing that got the attention of the federal government, and they indeed did not close the Grand Canyon, even while other parts of the federal government were closing down. Both Governors Napolitano and Brewer have sent the National Guard units to the Arizona border to assist the Federal Border Patrol with immigration enforcement. So, historically, this role as commander-in-chief is merely a symbolic role, but occasionally a strong governor faced with a crisis has used the Guard for political purposes. One final head of state function worthy of mention is the ability of the governor to grant clemency to prisoners. Again, going back to the progressive roots of the Constitution, the founders felt that allowing the governor to grant leniency would be a check on the potential abuse of power or a remedy to an unjust outcome of a trial. Now, there are three options available to the governor. First, they can pardon a criminal, which releases the convicted person from all criminal penalties and clears their record. Second, the governor can commute the sentence, which means to reduce the sentence. An example of this would be changing a death sentence to one of life imprisonment. Or another example might be to take someone and declare that their sentence has been time served, which would allow for their immediate release. A third option is a reprieve, which just delays carrying out the sentence. A reprieve might be given for personal reasons or for health reasons. There was one example from early Arizona history where a gentleman had a device that he claimed could make electricity out of air, the ionization of the air. And the governor from New Mexico was so taken by this device that they wanted that person to go to Washington, D.C. to get a patent for it and start manufacturing it. The problem was the person who created this device was in prison, in an Arizona prison, for fraud. And so the Arizona governor granted a reprieve, which enabled this prisoner to leave and travel to Washington, D.C., where he did indeed file a patent, and then he came back and served out the rest of his sentence. So it's fairly rare, but that power does exist, that the governor has for clemency. The governor is expected to take a leading role in setting the legislative agenda for the state. The governor often proposes legislation, though, unlike the president, the governor cannot directly submit a bill to the legislature. So that means the governor has to find a friendly legislator to formally submit that bill. In addition, the governor gives a State of the State address each year and typically uses that speech as a way to attempt to set the legislative agenda for the upcoming legislative session. The governor can also call a special session of the legislature. This requires the legislature to reconvene and discuss whatever issue the governor had brought them for. Now, the legislature is not obligated to do what the governor wants them to do, but it does draw attention to an issue and again sets the agenda that the legislatures will discuss. Now, legislators don't like having to come back to the Capitol building after the session is over. So sometimes even the threat of calling a special session will get the legislature to enact legislation that is favorable to the governor to prevent that from happening. Now, another way the governor can affect the outcome of legislation is with the threat of a veto. Now, while the legislature is capable of overriding the governor's veto, this actually rarely happens. The veto typically stands. The legislation is often not passed until the very end of the session because of the dynamics of the legislature that was discussed in the previous presentation. It's usually a rush job at the end. And so there's not sufficient time to vote to overturn the veto. Also, the legislature has relied on the majority party, the Republican caucus, to pass legislation, which means the Democratic caucus has no say in legislation and therefore very little interest in helping the leadership overcome a governor's veto. So, for all those reasons, the vetoes typically stand. Another obstacle to overturn the veto is the required supermajority, which, again, is difficult to muster. So this means that even the threat of a veto can sometimes alter the composition of a piece of legislation. Now, one limitation to the use of the veto, though, is that the governor has to veto the entire bill or none of it. And so the governors will frequently resist vetoing a bill even if they don't like it because of the good provisions that are in that bill. Now, an exception to this are budgetary measures, where the governor can do a line item veto, and we'll talk about that in a later presentation. But in general, the governor has to veto the entire bill. So this means that the legislature can package provisions the governor doesn't like with things the governor does like into the same bill, into a package deal, as an encouragement for the governor to not veto the bill. Now, all the modern governors have used the veto or threatened to the veto to try to influence legislation. So it's a powerful tool in the arsenal of the governor. The governor has a particular role to play when it comes to the state's fiscal policy. The governors are required by the state constitution to submit a budget for all state agencies and programs. Now, the legislature is not required to enact that budget, but the governor's budget usually serves as a starting point for budgetary discussions in the legislature. So it can be quite powerful as an agenda-setting tactic. Perhaps the greatest tool government has when it comes to fiscal policy is the line item veto. Unlike regular legislation that involves appropriating funds is subject to a line item veto. This means the governor can veto specific select portions of the budget while leaving the rest of the bill intact. This makes it impossible for the legislature to bundle friendly and unfriendly provisions in the same bill. In a budget battle, then, the governor's wishes carry tremendous weight. Now, this can lead to conflict between the legislative and executive branches, and that conflict was quite significant and defined the politics of Arizona in the late 2000s. The state was beginning to have some budgetary problems, and the legislature sought to enact tax cuts which would further decrease the revenues available to the state, combined with deep cuts in social programs and other programs that the governor felt were essential. And so the governor threatened a veto, but the legislature, in a move of solidarity and in a test of wills, sent a budget to the governor anyways, fully expecting her to veto it, which she did. She then, Governor Napolitano, vetoed the bill, which enabled the legislature to blame the governor for the shutdowns in government services that would occur if a budget was not passed. And so there was a bit of a staring contest between the governor and the legislature to see who would blink first and which side would allow the state governments to shut down in this budget impasse. Now, ultimately, the governor was able to convince a few Republican legislatures to vote for a budget package that she would approve, which meant that the governor essentially won that staring contest. The legislature blinked before the governor did. But that battle is sort of emblematic of the real power that the governor has when it comes to fiscal matters. On the federal level, the President of the United States does not have a line item veto. Congress passed a line item veto briefly during the George Bush Sr. administration, sort of expecting that the next president would be a Republican. But when Bill Clinton became president, he began to use that line item veto in ways that members of Congress didn't appreciate. And so the Republican Party activists took that law to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually overturned the line item veto. So on the federal level, the president has only had a line item veto for a couple of years. They no longer have that power. And so all of the negotiations over budget issues have to take place before Congress passes their budget package. And Congress typically passes an omnibus budget bill. So the entire budget is thrown into one piece that the president has to either veto or let pass. Contrast that with Arizona, with the line item veto available for fiscal issues. The governor has the upper hand on the legislature. The governor can negotiate while the budget is being formed, and then the governor can continue to negotiate after the budget has been passed by eliminating those parts of the budget the governor doesn't want and requiring the legislature to go back and redo those parts. The terms of combat, so to speak, are in the governor's favor when it comes to budgetary issues. And so that's a power that is not unique to Arizona, but it helps explain a lot of the outcomes of the political battles with the budget here. The last role to discuss for the governor is that of CEO of the executive branch. The governor is ultimately responsible for the actions of the state government and can direct agencies to do things that promote the governor's agenda. One way to control state government, then, is through issuing executive orders. An example of this would be when Janet Napolitano was governor. She wanted Arizona to participate in a regional climate initiative that was being spearheaded by California and had the participation of Nevada and New Mexico. The legislature, on the other hand, was not interested at all in passing environmental legislation, particularly legislation that might cap carbon emissions. The state is already struggling with the EPA over air quality, and the legislature did not want to make it even more difficult for the business sectors to operate here. So, in the absence of legislative action, Governor Napolitano issued an executive order for the Department of Environmental Quality, the Arizona DEQ, and ordered that department to participate in these regional discussions for carbon emission reductions, as well as other environmental protocols with water and air quality. When Napolitano resigned her position as governor to take the post of Secretary of Department of Homeland Security under President Obama, Jan Brewer became the governor. And one of the very first things she did as governor was reverse that executive order. And so Arizona then no longer, the Department of Environmental Quality no longer was authorized to develop environmental guidelines for carbon reductions or water or air reductions beyond that was mandated by the federal government. And in fact, the governor issued a new executive order that prohibited the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality from even attending the meetings for the regional climate initiative. And they couldn't even have that conversation anymore. So it's an example of the governor's power to control the state government and set the agenda through executive order. Now, another way to control the state government is through appointments. The governor appoints the heads of the state agencies, appoints people to various governing boards and statewide commissions. The governor also appoints judges. Now, these appointees, with the exception of the judges, serve at the pleasure of the governor, and so they could be expected to follow the governor's directions or be replaced by someone who would follow those directions. Now, as you may recall from the presentation on the bureaucracy, though, in Presentation 10, this does not necessarily mean that the government can control the state government. Bureaucracies have many ways to stall or redirect initiatives that come from the chief executive, even when the heads of those agencies are pushing for those initiatives. The career employees at state agencies know that if they disagree with the policy direction, that they can simply wait for a new governor to come into town, and that direction may change, sometimes dramatically, as we saw with the example of the DEQ and the Regional Climate Initiative. Now, the ability of the governor to direct the state is further complicated by the fact that the governor does not appoint key members of the executive branch. As discussed earlier, under the plural executive model that we have, these other officials are elected independent of the governor. So the governor has very few ways to put pressure on those individuals. Let's now examine those other offices.